All right, so chapter 7 is our respiratory system. Normally, I would ask the class, what is the purpose of the system? And a lot of you would say to obtain atmospheric oxygen for the body's tissues and to rid the body of carbon dioxide. So that's the main fundamental reason for breathing. That's the fundamental reason of our respiratory system. So our objectives. So first, looking at explaining the mechanisms of breathing, describing airflow. We'll get into some different terms, one being pulmonary ventilation, gas diffusion. This is our oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, how that's related to myoglobin and hemoglobin. And then we'll discuss respiratory control during exercise and our ventilatory response. So here's our part 1. So we want to understand primary function, but we also have to understand structure. So how is our respiratory system designed? And then we'll look at how pressure changes during ventilation. So first we have to go over some terminology here. So cellular respiration, this actually occurs in the mitochondria, and this was discussed in chapter 3. So the reason I put this in here is just so you don't get this term confused with like pulmonary respiration or pulmonary diffusion. So that's where we get into, anytime there's pulmonary, that's referring to the lungs. Cellular respiration, again, that's referring to the mitochondria. So with pulmonary respiration, we have 2 types. We have pulmonary ventilation, and this is just your breathing. So this is all of our breathing mechanism, so movement of air into and out of the lungs. So basic, easy definition, and this is just breathing. Pulmonary diffusion is not the movement of air, but the movement of gases. We talked about in chapter 6 how gas or blood moves from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So we'll kind of discuss that as well. With pulmonary diffusion, we have kind of 2 different directions in which these gases will move. So we have oxygen. So oxygen will move from the lungs to the blood. And so we're specifically talking about the oxygen that gets into structures called alveoli in our lungs. And then that oxygen is going to diffuse into the blood surrounding, or in the capillaries surrounding those alveoli. And then the opposite direction is we have carbon dioxide in the blood, which is inside the capillaries surrounding the alveoli, and that's going to move into the lungs so we can exhale that. So just kind of simple definition, pulmonary diffusion is just the movement of oxygen in the lungs to the blood and the movement of carbon dioxide in the blood to the lungs. Another term is gas transport. So instead of the movement of air or the movement of gas, now we have the movement of blood containing gases. So blood is the primary transporter of these gases throughout the body. So when the blood is moving, it contains oxygen, it contains carbon dioxide. That's just basically our gas transport. So it's how these gases are transported. And then last is capillary gas exchange. So capillary is referring to the periphery. So referring to, let's say, the capillaries in a muscle. So a capillary bed. So this is the exchange of gases between the blood and the tissues at the periphery. So the oxygen in the tissues, the CO2 out of the tissues is the direction in which these gases would move. This is necessary to maintain high levels of oxygen for aerobic respiration and low levels of CO2. We already know the muscles produce CO2, so kind of keep that in mind as we go through this lecture. Where did that CO2 come from? Our muscles, our organs are producing that CO2 as a waste product, and we have to get that carbon dioxide to our lungs so we can exhale it. So know these terms. These terms will be asked on the next quiz, also on the assignment. You may have to define these, so just kind of keep these terms in mind as we go through this lecture. Okay, primary functions of the respiratory system. The 2 primary ones we want to start with is the conduction of air into and out of the lungs. So conductor of air, and then the second most important is the exchange of gases. We already talked about how these gases are exchanged. We're talking about oxygen and CO2 between the air in our lungs and then the blood surrounding the capillaries in our lungs. So those are the 2 primary functions, and we'll explain each of those in detail as we move through these slides. But some other functions that we don't normally think of would be to humidify our air. So humidifying the air, what this is, it's basically adding water molecules. So this prevents damage to membranes. Damage to membranes would come from drying out or desiccation. Desiccation is extreme dryness of those membranes. This is particularly important in cold and dry climates. What happens here is there's an increase in water vapor content of the air in the respiratory system, and that moistens the air as it travels. So if air is really cold, really dry, especially in those climates, that can irritate and damage those membranes. So humidification is just adding water molecules to the air. So that kind of softens or moistens the air as it travels down those delicate structures. Next is the warming of our air. So what this is maintains temperatures of the lungs. So of the lung structures, of the gas exchange needed in a cold environment. And then next is filtering the air. So cleaning away our airways. So this is important in polluted or dusty environments. Lubbock is very dusty and windy, but there's small particles present in virtually all air. So the mucus in our respirators, and that's what this picture shows here. We have the cilia, and this is a picture of that cilia there. The mucus that kind of lines these membranes will actually trap those airborne particles and move it towards our oral cavities so we can expel that debris or expel that those molecules. So those are kind of our main, most important functions of the respiratory system. Now let's look at that conduction of air. So the movement of air follows a specific pathway. So we'll start kind of at the top. So our nose leads to our nasal cavity, which leads to our pharynx, which I have pointed or circled right here. The pharynx will then lead to our larynx. So you see that our esophagus is right behind the larynx. What we want to focus on is the larynx, and where this is that leads down to the lungs. The larynx it kind of leads down to the trachea, which will then split into a right and left main bronchus. What will happen next is they will branch off extensively into the bronchioles. So the bronchioles or the bronchi are going to be all those little tree-like structures that you see. And then lastly is the alveoli. So the alveoli we'll discuss on the next page. But what I want you to notice here is the pulmonary artery. So we see the blue pulmonary artery that's taking deoxygenated blood away from the heart. And then we have the pulmonary veins, which then delivers oxygenated blood back to the lungs. Back to the heart. We'll get into the function of the pulmonary artery and the pulmonary vein later in the role of the capillaries. But let's now look at the alveoli. So what I want you to note is that no gas exchange takes place in any of these structures until we get to the alveoli, and that's what this statement says here. So no gas exchange takes place from the nostrils all the way down to the bronchioles. And again, gas exchange is just the passing of oxygen and CO2 across a specific membrane. So what we want to look at here, let's talk about the alveoli or veoli, what those are. They're basically sac-like structures surrounded by capillaries where gas exchange takes place. So the passing of carbon dioxide and oxygen back and forth across the membrane. So on average, human lungs have about 480 million alveoli, with the range being 274 to 790 million. The number of alveoli is closely related to total lung volume, and we know lung volume is related to body size. So larger bodies have larger lungs, therefore they're going to have more alveoli, which results in greater gas exchange. So that large number of alveoli results in a tremendous surface area for gas diffusion. This is why one person can actually live a normal life with just one lung due to all the alveoli that we have and all the capillaries surrounding each one. And that's what you can see here in this bottom circled picture. So oxygen and CO2 exchange will be between the air in the alveoli and the blood passing by those capillaries that are surrounding the alveoli. And we'll kind of explain that more on this next slide here. So what this looks like this here is a red blood cell. And so we know red blood cells carry oxygen. This here is the alveolar wall, and then, or the alveoli. Here's the alveolar wall, and then here's our capillary wall. So you see this point out right here. This is the respiratory membrane. So this respiratory membrane is very thin. It's only like 2 millimeters thick. So this is the membrane in which CO2 has to diffuse across. So let's start back here. We have one alveoli and we have our capillary. So our capillary bed we know is made up of a vein and an artery, the arterioles, the venules, and then there is our capillary. All right, and this next picture here is just looking at a cross-sectional view. So it basically looks just like if we cut this in half, so we see that plane slicing this in half. Now we're looking at the cross-sectional view here. So what this then takes is the capillary wall with the alveolar wall. So what our main focus here is to look at diffusion. So with this diffusion, we already know we have a really large surface area available for gas exchange, and it is increased by the wrapping of each alveoli with a capillary. So the total surface area, if we took all of our capillaries that we have surrounding our alveoli and spread them out, guess how far it would reach? So it would be roughly about the size of a tennis court. So 70 meters squared. And that's, again, if we take our capillaries that surround every single one of our 400 million alveoli and spread them out, they would equal the size of a tennis court. So that's just saying we have a big surface area. And so that's a lot of diffusion that can take place. And that's important for gas exchange, which we'll talk about the benefits of gas exchange during exercise later. So kind of summary this slide, the gas must pass through those two membranes to move between the air in the alveoli and the blood in the capillaries. So the oxygen obtained in the air inside the alveoli will diffuse across that membrane into the blood cell. And then the CO2 will move from the blood cell and it will diffuse across the membrane into the alveoli, which then now it can be exhaled from the lungs. If you watch this video down here at the bottom, I think you have the same link. You can kind of watch just an animation of how air travels through the respiratory system and goes through gas exchange. Now let's talk about the mechanisms of ventilation. So first, this question here, we want to understand about our lung tissue. So we know lung tissue is capable of contraction in a similar fashion to muscle, even though the lung is not made of muscle. So the next question is, so how are we able to breathe in and out? So normally I would turn this over to the students to where y'all would provide answers for this. What we want to understand is the lungs do not actively expand and recoil by themselves, but rather acted upon in two different ways. So the diaphragm, by the downward and upward movement of the diaphragm to lengthen and shorten the chest cavity. So that's kind of one way. The diaphragm aids in breathing patterns and it helps to elevate the lungs during expiration. And then during inspiration, it'll flatten and allow air to fill those lungs. We'll look at some pictures of that in just a second. The other one is elastic resistance. So elastic resistance and recoil of the lungs. So the ability of the lungs to expand and fill with air is measured by lung compliance and then resistance to stretching too far. So this is the elastic resistance. And then returning to its original length and size when stretched is the elastic recoil of the lungs. So elastic recoil of the lungs connective tissue, which is just made of elastic fibers. So after being stretched by inhalation, it'll recoil and return back to its size. So those are kind of the two main reasons. We'll talk later about how force exerts a surface tension, which will increase pressure in the lungs, causing it to contract and relax as well. But let's continue with talking about the lungs and kind of what they're made of. So the lungs are made of a double-layered membrane, which is called a pleura, that encases each lung. So there's two pleuras. There's the visceral pleura, which is the outer surface, and then there's a parietal, which is the inner surface of the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm. So inside each of those layers is a fluid. So we see a lubricating fluid between the two. The purpose of the fluid is to reduce friction between the lungs and the inner thoracic wall and the lungs and the diaphragm. So as the lungs increase and decrease in volume of breathing, we don't want, the lungs should not rub up against the outside of that pleura or that case or the membrane. So that fluid there is, again, just to protect friction. Let's talk about another important factor about that fluid, is the fluid itself will create a pressure. So the pleural fluid creates an intrapleural, or also called intrathoracic pressure. So this is the pressure in the pleural cavity between those two membranes, so between the visceral and the parietal. So let's talk about what does that pressure result in. So first, we have to note that this pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. So we haven't really defined atmospheric pressure yet. Just know that atmospheric pressure, also called barometric pressure, is the force exerted by the atmosphere at a given point. It's basically the weight of the air. So the pressure between those two pleural, that pressure, the interpleural pressure, is less than atmospheric pressure. And so what does that allow for? That allows or makes sure that the lungs stick to the surface of the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm. So let's give an example. If the rib cage moves, the lungs remain in contact with the surface of the thoracic cavity and the diaphragm. This does result in a change in lung volume. The muscles external to the lungs create a change in the thoracic cavity volume for the air to move in and out. So basically, the fact that the pressure within the pleural cavity, so that interpleural pressure, is less than atmospheric pressure, and it's less in the air in the alveoli, this causes the lungs to adhere to the inner surface of the thoracic cavity and adhere to the diaphragm. So anytime the lungs move, the diaphragm moves. Anytime the lungs move, the rib cage also moves. So they're basically stuck together, and again, it's due to this fluid creating a pressure between the two membranes. So let's talk about those pressure differences, and now let's apply inspiration versus expiration. So let's look at interpulmonary, which on your slides it may say interpulmonic, so it's basically the same thing. So interpulmonary or interpulmonic pressure, when that's greater than atmospheric pressure, the air will move out of the lungs, which equals expiration. So why does this occur? Think back to what we said. Air moves in and out of the lungs due to pressure differences, and air always moves from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So if the pressure in our lungs, so interpulmonary is the pressure within the lungs, if that pressure is greater than the pressure in the atmosphere, then we're going to have expiration. So the air will move from higher pressures to an area of lower pressure. So it will move out. So that's expiration. The opposite occurs for inspiration. So now let's say atmospheric pressure is greater than our interpulmonary pressure. So if it's greater than interpulmonary, that means the air within the atmosphere will now move into our lungs, moving from high to low. So that causes inspiration. Let's talk about what happens when we are between breaths. So between breaths, we did not take a huge inhalation and we did not expire. So it's in between breaths, which occurs for a few seconds. There's no movement of air here. When no movement of air takes place, interpulmonary and atmospheric pressure are equal. Let's look at this picture, which shows that as well. So this shows each of the pleura. So we have the parietal pleura, which is the outside, our visceral pleura, which is the inside. We have our pleural cavity, which contains the fluid. So we know there's an interpleural pressure here, and then the interpulmonary pressure is the pressure within the actual lungs. And then atmospheric pressure we see as the air that's entering into the lungs. So one thing to keep in mind through this lecture is atmospheric pressure at sea level is 760 millimeters of mercury, which is shown right here. This picture depicts that we are in between breaths and that the pressure in our lungs is the same. It's also 760 millimeters of mercury. So in that instance, there would be no movement of air and the pressure is equal. Let's look at this picture, and this will shows how pressure in our lungs will decrease and increase, causing inspiration and expiration. So I've abbreviated our kind of words up here. So we have interpulmonary, we now have is less than AP, which is atmospheric. So let's first start kind of over here. So we have atmospheric, we have 760. And at rest, just like the last picture, it's the same pressure. So when we have no breathing, we're not holding our breath, we're just at rest, the pressure is the same, no movement of air. Now let's look and see what happens with inspiration. So with inspiration, we have a decrease. So there's a decrease in interpulmonary pressure. So the pressure in the lungs has decreased from 760 to 758 millimeters of mercury. Always keep in mind the atmospheric pressure at sea level is always 760. So now that the pressure in the atmosphere is greater than it is in our lungs, we're going to inspire. The air is going to move into our lungs. Opposite down here, looking at expiration. So now we see that we have expired. We've expired, we've pushed out all of our air. So now the size of our lungs decreases. Since the size of the lungs decreases, the pressure increases. And you can read that here. We have a decrease in lung volume, and we now have a higher pressure. The pressure is higher in the lungs than it is in the atmosphere. So that causes us to exhale because it moves always from high areas of pressure to lower areas of pressure. So let's continue with the pressure changes during inspiration and expiration. So this here kind of like summarizes what that picture just said. So during inspiration, we have an increase in lung volume. So I would tell you this even if you were in class, but I want you to do it. I want you to take a deep breath. So when you take a deep breath, you can feel your lungs expand. So we have an increase, number one, in lung volume. Number two, in the volume of the entire cavity. The entire cavity includes the rib cage, just our entire thoracic cavity. But when we have an increase in volume, there's a decrease in pressure. So pressure drops. Why does pressure drop when there's a greater volume? Because now there's more space for those air molecules to move around. And if there's more space, there's less pressure. Next, we have expiration. So again, what I want you to do is a forced expiration. So inhale and then forcefully exhale. So now we have a decreased lung volume. You can even feel that pressure increase inside your lungs when you push out. So the volume decreases, which again decreases the total interthoracic cavity, but now the pressure is greater. The pressure is greater because there's a smaller volume. There's less space for all those air molecules to move around. So what you want to understand is there's an inverse relationship between volume and pressure. Decreased volume equals increased pressure. There's more space in the cavity for those air molecules to move. So what explains this? Pressure gradients. So pressure gradients created by changing the volume of thoracic cavity. So these gradients are created during inspiration and expiration. So changing the volume of the cavity will alter the pressure difference between the atmosphere and the interthoracic air. Again, air flows from high areas of pressure to low areas of pressure. There's a law that explains this. What law is that? That's Boyle's law. So remember, you're explaining or you're describing Boyle's law in your assignment. You're basically explaining how does this law explain ventilation and all the mechanisms that have to do with pulmonary ventilation. So looking at Boyle's law, it's basically what we just described. So how the pressure of a gas tends to increase as the volume decreases. And it's shown in this kind of picture down here. So this is looking at a volume, or we have a container. So we're measuring the volume in this container, and we have these certain molecules. We'll say they're oxygen molecules. So we have these oxygen molecules, and then you see in the second, we are pushing down, we're decreasing the volume or the space in which those oxygen molecules can move around. So we see over here the pressure, it's measured as 1 because there's more space, less pressure. But now as there's less space, that pressure increases because there's less space for those molecules to move. So again, just another statement, the absolute pressure exerted by a given mass of an ideal gas is inversely proportional to the volume it occupies. And this goes even further, talking about even if the temperature of the gas remains the same. But we don't really get into temperature until a different law, and we'll discuss that a little later. So there's Boyle's law for you. Now what you want to do is explain inspiration and expiration and what happens to the interthoracic cavity. But let's continue to talk about muscles, and let's talk about inspiration and expiration and the difference in the muscles involved. So this here talks about rest. So at rest, the diaphragm does all the work. So this is one of our most important muscles. The diaphragm is going to flatten as it contracts. So it flattens, and that allows the lungs to increase in volume. So if the diaphragm flattens down, the lungs can expand. So it allows the lungs to fill as the abdominal move, or pushing the abdominal kind of organs downward with contraction. So this pulls in motion pressure changes that cause inspiration and results in an increase in the interthoracic volume. So we have a greater volume, that diaphragm contracts, the lungs expand. So diaphragm performs all the inspiratory work at rest. What about during exercise? So during exercise, this is different. The diaphragm still works, but we have inspiratory muscles to help elevate the rib cage. This is basically when greater changes in the thoracic volume are needed to ventilate a greater volume of air. So when we have to ventilate more air, we have to recruit more muscles. So let's talk about each one of these. So we have internal intercostals. These are located between the ribs, and they elevate the rib cage with contraction and increase the thoracic volume. The scalenes are 3 pairs of muscles located on either side, the side and the front of the throat, and they elevate the ribs and they tilt the neck backwards a little bit. And then the sternocleidomastoid is located on the side of the neck, and they also elevate the ribs. So the sternocleidomastoid is talking about the sternum, Cleo is talking about the clavicle, and then mastoid is talking about the jaw. So it's a muscle that kind of attaches to all of those structures and elevates the ribs. And then the pectoralis minor is kind of also connects to the clavicular head and will also raise the rib cage. Let's now talk about expiration. So expiration, there is no muscular effort needed at rest. So think about it. When you are at a rested state and you're just breathing normally, you're not having to recruit extra muscles to do this. So what's happening? Passive recoil of the diaphragm. We already said the diaphragm is made of elastic tissue, and when you stretch elastic tissue, it recoils back. So it's going to recoil back, and also it's going to decrease that interthoracic volume. So elastic properties of the diaphragm: relax, moves upward, and pushes the air out. This puts in motion the change of the interthoracic pressure that will eventually cause our inspiration later. But during exercise or forced voluntary expiration, so think about inhaling and then forcefully pushing all your air out, or during exercise, you notice that you're going to feel some tension kind of in your abdominal region. So we have accessory expiratory muscles now contracting and pulling the ribs downward. So let's discuss each one of those. So internal intercostals are also located in between the ribs. The rectus abdominis is our front kind of abdominal muscle, and then our internal oblique muscles are the bottom edge of our rib cage. So this is called our abdominal wall or the muscular corset. So the contraction of these muscles will increase interthoracic pressure and decrease cavity volume, so allowing that air to be expelled out. So the volume of air ventilated during exercise can be increased due to the contraction of the accessory muscles. Another fact is that normal respiration at rest only takes about 3 to 5% of the total energy expended by the body that's required for pulmonary ventilation. But very heavy exercise, the amount of energy required can increase by up to 8 to 15% of the total body's energy expenditure, especially with exercise-induced asthma, which we'll talk about a little bit later. This video down here is just a clip from Muscle in Motion. What it will show is just the different muscles that surround the rib cage, so you can kind of look at that if you're interested. So next here, let's look at those muscles with just kind of a picture applied. So inspiration, we have our diaphragm, which I've kind of pointed to underneath here. So basically, if you peel back the muscles of our torso and kind of look underneath the rib cage, you'll see this kind of dome-shaped muscle. It's very flat, and this muscle will, as it contracts, it will flatten, and then it will also relax, and when it relaxes, it pushes upward, so allows for inspiration and expiration at rest. Forced expiration uses all these accessory muscles. So I've circled them on either side. So we see muscles of inspiration. So here we have the sternocleidomastoid and then the 3 scalene muscles, elevating, kind of pulling up on the clavicle. We have pectoralis minor, which is tucked in here, attaches to the clavicular head, and then the external intercostals, which will elevate the ribs upward. So that's for inspiration as we take a deep breath. And then expiration, as we force the air out, we see more internal, or our internal intercostals located in between the ribs. Then we see our rectus abdominis, our external oblique, internal oblique, and then transverse abdominis on the side here. So all those muscles, when they contract, they kind of pull downward, so allowing for that air to exhale. This video down here also shows mechanics of breathing. So if you're interested in just kind of a little bit more information about how these muscles work and how breathing works, watch that video if you're curious. So lastly would be a critical thinking that we would do together as a class, and it kind of discusses the diaphragm. It discusses what this muscle is, and then y'all are supposed to kind of answer each one of these questions about diaphragmatic breathing. How do you perform? How is it different from regular breathing? What happens to the pressure? But since we are not together, and there are no questions over this, we really don't have to discuss it. But if you're curious and want some information, feel free to look up if you're kind of interested in that topic. But that's all we have for part 1 of the respiratory system. We will pick up with part 2.